The dust in Redemption Gulch was a character in itself, a constant swirling presence that coated everything in a fine layer of ochre. It settled on the weathered planks of the buildings, on the stoic faces of its inhabitants, and especially on the forlorn patch of dirt behind the Golden Nugget Saloon. This was Sombra's world, a world defined by the gnawing emptiness in his belly and the echoing silence of abandonment. Sombra, a mutt of indeterminate breed, but with a heart full of loyalty, had once known a different kind of life. He'd been Eleanor Vance's companion, a flicker of warmth in the cold, empty house she'd inherited after her husband's untimely passing. But grief, or perhaps something darker, had twisted Eleanor's heart into a knot of bitterness. The dog, once a source of comfort, became a painful reminder of happier times, a living embodiment of everything she felt she had lost. One sweltering afternoon, with a harshness that belied her delicate frame, Eleanor had unceremoniously dumped Sombra behind the saloon, his worn leather collar still around his neck, and driven away in her buggy, leaving him to the mercy of the unforgiving frontier. Days blurred into an agonizing cycle of hunger and thirst. The saloon's back door, a gateway to tantalizing smells of stew and roasting meat, remained stubbornly closed to him. Occasionally, a gruff cook would toss out a scrap, a gesture more of annoyance than charity, but it was rarely enough to quell the desperate ache. Sombra's ribs began to show beneath his matted fur, his once bright eyes dulled with a profound sadness. He'd whimper softly, a mournful sound swallowed by the relentless wind, and curl up in the meager shade offered by a discarded barrel, his tail tucked tight against his emaciated body. The Golden Nugget, despite its grand name, was a rough-and-tumble establishment. Miners, cowboys, and drifters alike frequented its dimly lit interior, their laughter and arguments spilling out into the street. They saw Sombra, of course. Some tossed him a pitying glance, others a curse, but no one intervened. In Redemption Gulch, survival was a solitary affair, and a stray dog was simply another mouth to feed that no one was willing to feed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a lone rider approached the town. Jedediah was a man forged by the land he traversed. His clothes were threadbare, his boots scuffed, and his horse, a sturdy mare named Dusty, looked as weary as he felt. He rode into Redemption Gulch with little more than the saddlebags on his back and a stubborn hope for honest work. He'd been drifting for weeks, taking odd jobs, sleeping under the stars, his pockets perpetually lighter than he'd like. Jedediah's mare snorted, her ears flicking towards the back of the Golden Nugget. He pulled her to a halt, his gaze drawn by a faint, pathetic whine. Curiosity piqued, he dismounted, tethered Dusty, and walked towards the sound. The smell of stale beer and refuse assaulted his senses, but it was the sight that truly struck him. Curled in a pathetic heap, barely able to lift his head, was a dog, a scrawny, neglected creature whose ribs were starkly visible beneath its dirty hide. There was a vacant look in its eyes, a profound emptiness that Jedediah recognized all too well. It was the look of a soul that had been battered and left for dead. He knelt down slowly, his movements gentle, not wanting to startle the animal. "Hey there, fella," he murmured, his voice soft and unhurried. The dog's head lifted slightly, a flicker of something, fear perhaps, or a faint spark of awareness in its weary gaze. Jedediah extended a hand, palm open, and waited. The dog's tail gave a tentative thump against the dirt, a tiny, hopeful gesture in the vast indifference of the world. Jedediah's heart, often guarded by the hardships he'd endured, ached with a sudden, fierce protectiveness. He knew in that moment that he couldn't just ride away. This creature, like him, deserved a chance. Jedediah's calloused hand trembled slightly as he reached for the dog. The animal flinched initially, a lifetime of harsh treatment ingrained in its very being, But then, as Jedediah's fingers gently stroked the matted fur behind its ears, a sigh escaped its thin frame. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, a surrender to a kindness it hadn't known in what felt like an eternity. The dog, weak but sensing no threat, leaned into the touch, its tail thumping a little more rhythmically against the packed earth. "You're in a bad way, ain't you?" Jedediah murmured, his voice rough but laced with genuine compassion. He observed the dog's gaunt frame, the dullness of its coat, the deep sorrow etched into its weary eyes. It was clear this creature had been through hell and back. He scanned the surroundings, looking for any sign of an owner, but found none. The back door of the Golden Nugget remained shut, the sounds of revelry inside a stark contrast to the quiet suffering outside. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that this dog had been deliberately discarded. With painstaking care, Jedediah scooped the dog into his arms. It was lighter than he'd expected, a fragile collection of bone and fur. The dog offered no resistance, its head resting against Jedediah's rough-spun shirt, its breathing shallow but steady. He carried it over to Dusty, his mare, who regarded the newcomer with a curious, gentle snort. "Easy, girl," Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. "He ain't gonna hurt you." He settled the dog onto a relatively clean corner of Dusty's saddle blanket, tucking it in as best he could. As Jedediah prepared to mount, a sharp voice cut through the evening air. "Hey, you there! What do you think you're doing?" He turned to see a stout woman, her face a mask of indignation, storming out from the saloon's side entrance. It was Mrs. Gable, the proprietor's wife, a woman known for her sharp tongue and even sharper eyes. She scowled at Jedediah, her gaze fixing on the dog nestled on Dusty's saddle. "That dog belongs to Mrs. Vance," she declared, her voice dripping with authority, "and she left it here for a reason. You can't just be taking strays, stranger." Jedediah met her glare, his own expression steady. "Mrs. Vance ain't here, Mum, and this dog looks like it's near death. I can't leave it here to starve." Mrs. Gable scoffed, crossing her arms over her ample chest. "Eleanor Vance is a woman of particular sensibilities. She decided she no longer wanted the animal. That's her business, and it's not yours nor anyone else's to interfere." A low growl, surprisingly strong, emanated from the dog. It lifted its head, its eyes fixed on Mrs. Gable with an intensity that surprised Jedediah. The dog, despite its weakened state, seemed to recognize the animosity in the woman's tone. "He's half-starved," Jedediah stated, his voice firm. "Looks like he hasn't had food or water in days. That ain't no way to treat any living creature, sensible or otherwise." Mrs. Gable huffed. "Well, he ain't my problem, and he won't be yours once Mrs. Vance decides she wants him back. You best put him down and be on your way." Jedediah looked from Mrs. Gable's disapproving face to the dog's watchful eyes. He saw a flicker of fear return to the animal's gaze, a subtle shrinking away. That was all the persuasion he needed. He swung himself into the saddle, carefully positioning himself so as not to disturb his fragile passenger. "I'm sorry, Ma'am," Jedediah said, tipping his hat with a politeness that barely masked his resolve, "but I reckon this dog's found a new home. He's coming with me." With a final, weary glance at the saloon and its disapproving guardian, Jedediah urged Dusty forward, leaving Redemption Gulch and its harsh realities behind. The dog, sensing the shift in direction and the gentle rhythm of the horse, let out another soft sigh, its head drooping back down onto the blanket. Jedediah named him Sombra, for the darkness he had emerged from, and for the shadow of neglect that had nearly consumed him. As they rode into the fading twilight, Jedediah knew that taking in this stray would present its own set of challenges, but as he felt the faint warmth of the dog against his leg, he also knew it was a challenge he was more than willing to face. The nearest established settlement of any size was a good 2 days' ride from Redemption Gulch, and Jedediah's meager funds wouldn't allow for a prolonged stay at any of the way stations he might encounter. He'd managed to procure a small, rather tough piece of jerky from a passing peddler just before leaving Redemption Gulch, and he immediately broke off a few pieces, offering them to Sombra. The dog devoured them with a desperate urgency, each bite a small victory against the gnawing hunger that had plagued him for so long. Jedediah watched, a quiet satisfaction warming him, as Sombra's tail gave a weak but definite wag. "Easy now," Jedediah advised, his voice gentle. "Plenty more where that came from if we can find it." He knew that overfeeding a starved animal could be as dangerous as letting it starve, so he rationed the jerky carefully, along with what little water he could spare from his own canteen. They made camp that first night under a sky ablaze with more stars than Jedediah had seen in months. The desert air was cool, a welcome respite from the day's heat. He spread his worn blanket near the campfire, and Sombra, after a tentative sniff, curled up beside him, his breathing still shallow but steadier now. Jedediah found himself watching the dog, a quiet contentment settling over him. It had been a long time since he'd had another living soul to share his meager campfire with. The silence, usually a companion Jedediah was accustomed to, felt different now, softened by the presence of the sleeping dog. The next morning, Jedediah noticed a distinct improvement in Sombra's demeanor. The dog was more alert, his tail wagging more enthusiastically at Jedediah's movements. He still looked pitifully thin, his ribs clearly visible, but there was a spark in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Jedediah shared his meager breakfast of hardtack and coffee, making sure Sombra got his share of water. "You're a trooper, Sombra," Jedediah said, scratching the dog behind the ears. Sombra responded with a soft woof, nudging Jedediah's hand with his nose. The bond between them, forged in the shared hardship of the previous day, was already beginning to solidify. Their journey continued, the landscape shifting from arid plains to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional hardy mesquite tree. Jedediah kept a watchful eye on Sombra, ensuring he didn't overexert himself. He'd fashioned a makeshift lead from a strip of rawhide, and Sombra trotted along beside Dusty, his gait still weak but determined. As they neared the town of Harmony Creek, Jedediah's hopes for finding work began to rise. Harmony Creek was known for its burgeoning lumber mill, and Jedediah, with his strong back and steady hands, figured he could find a place there. However, as they rode into the dusty outskirts of the town, a familiar, unwelcome sight greeted them. It was Eleanor Vance, her buggy parked outside the general store, her face a picture of cold fury. She'd clearly heard of Sombra's whereabouts, perhaps from the ever-gossiping Mrs. Gable. As Jedediah approached, she strode towards him, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of Sombra trotting beside Dusty. "You," she spat, her voice sharp and accusatory. "You took my dog. I told that woman at the saloon you weren't to touch him." Jedediah reined Dusty to a halt, placing himself between Eleanor and Sombra. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I found this dog abandoned and near death. He's my responsibility now." Eleanor's face contorted with a mixture of anger and something akin to panic. "He is not your responsibility. He is my dog, and I will have him back." She took a step towards Sombra, her hand outstretched as if to snatch him. Sombra, sensing Eleanor's aggressive posture and the underlying threat in her voice, let out a low growl and moved closer to Jedediah's leg, a clear sign of his loyalty and his fear of the woman who had abandoned him. The growl, though still weak, carried a surprising weight of defiance. "He doesn't want to go with you, ma'am," Jedediah stated, his gaze unwavering. "He's been through enough. I'm not letting him go back to that kind of treatment." Eleanor Vance let out a frustrated shriek. "You can't do this. I'll have the sheriff on you. You're stealing my property." Jedediah tipped his hat again, a gesture that felt increasingly like a polite dismissal. "I'm sorry you feel that way, ma'am, but this dog ain't property. He's a living being, and he deserves better. I'm taking him to the lumber mill, looking for work. I'll see he's fed and cared for properly." With that, Jedediah urged Dusty forward, leaving Eleanor Vance fuming in the middle of the dusty street. He felt a pang of unease, knowing that Eleanor Vance was not the type of person to let such an affront go unanswered. But as he glanced down at Sombra, who looked up at him with a trust that warmed his soul, he knew he had made the right choice. The path ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with challenges, but for the first time in a long time, Jedediah felt a sense of purpose, a shared journey that made the arduous road ahead seem a little less lonely. Harmony Creek was a town carved out of necessity and ambition. Nestled beside a winding river, its primary lifeblood was the towering forest that surrounded it, from which lumber was hewn and shaped. The air here was thick with the scent of pine and sawdust, a constant hum of activity emanating from the bustling sawmills. Jedediah, with Sombra trotting faithfully by his side, rode towards the heart of the town, his eyes scanning for any sign of opportunity. The townsfolk, accustomed to the rough-and-tumble nature of frontier life, were generally a hardy, no-nonsense sort. They eyed the newcomer with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. A lone cowboy with a scrawny, bedraggled dog was hardly an uncommon sight, but there was something about Jedediah's quiet determination that set him apart. Sombra, despite his improved condition, Jedediah had managed to procure a small bag of oats, and some scraps from the livery stable still bore the visible marks of his past neglect. His ribs were less prominent, his coat a little less dull, but he was far from a picture of health. Jedediah found the foreman of the largest lumber mill, a burly man named Silas Croft, a man whose hands were as rough as the timber he worked. Silas was initially gruff, his gaze sweeping over Jedediah and then lingering on Sombra with a distinct lack of enthusiasm. "Looking for work, are ya?" Silas grunted, wiping sweat from his brow with a grimy forearm. "We need strong backs here, not pet owners." He gestured dismissively at Sombra. "That hound looks like he'd be more trouble than he's worth, likely to chase the horses or get underfoot." Jedediah stood his ground, meeting Silas's hardened gaze. "I'm a hard worker, sir. And this dog, he's seen his share of hard times. He's more of a shadow than a nuisance. He's quiet and he stays close. I'll make sure he doesn't cause any trouble. I just need a chance." Silas rubbed his chin, considering. He'd seen men with worse habits than a stray dog. He also saw the earnestness in Jedediah's eyes, the quiet strength that hinted at resilience. And to be fair, the dog did look like it needed a square meal and a bit of kindness. "All right, cowboy," Silas relented, a flicker of grudging respect in his tone. "We're short-handed. You can start tomorrow. Dawn, you'll work logging. Tough work, and if that dog so much as barks at a team of oxen, he's gone. Understand?" "Understood, sir," Jedediah replied, a wave of relief washing over him. "Thank you." As Jedediah led Dusty towards the livery stable, Sombra trotting diligently beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor Vance wouldn't be so easily deterred. He'd caught a glimpse of her earlier, conversing animatedly with a stern-looking man in a sheriff's uniform outside the general store. The man nodded thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping over Jedediah and Sombra as they passed. A knot of apprehension tightened in Jedediah's stomach. He had a job, a place to rest his head for the night, and a companion who clearly depended on him. But it seemed their troubles were far from over. That evening, as Jedediah settled into the small Spartan bunkhouse provided for the mill workers, Sombra curled up at his feet. Jedediah shared a portion of his oats with the dog, and Sombra, now with a more settled demeanor, ate with less urgency, his tail thumping a contented rhythm against the wooden floor. The air in the bunkhouse was thick with the smell of sweat and cheap tobacco, but Jedediah found a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. The other loggers, a motley crew of men from various walks of life, eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, but no one challenged him or his dog. As he drifted off to sleep, Jedediah's thoughts returned to Eleanor Vance and the sheriff. He knew he'd done nothing wrong by taking in a starving animal, but he also understood the ways of the West. Property rights, however unjustifiably claimed, were often enforced with swift and unforgiving hands. He would have to tread carefully, earn his keep, and prove that he and Sombra were not a burden, but a valuable addition to Harmony Creek. The shadow of abandonment had been replaced by the shadow of potential conflict, but Jedediah was ready to face it, with Sombra by his side. The dawn in Harmony Creek arrived not with a gentle glow, but with a brutal, piercing chill that seeped into the bones. The air, usually alive with the scent of pine, was now heavy with the biting cold of an early autumn morning. Jedediah, who had slept fitfully, was already on his feet, the rough wool of his shirt doing little to ward off the pre-dawn frost. Sombra stirred at his feet, a soft whine escaping him as he stretched, his movements still stiff but more fluid than they had been days before. Silas Croft was a man of his word, and his word was that work began at dawn. Jedediah, along with the other loggers, gathered at the edge of the towering forest, the colossal trees standing like silent sentinels against the pale sky. The foreman, Silas, a man whose gruff exterior hid a pragmatic mind, distributed the day's assignments. Jedediah was assigned to a felling crew, tasked with the dangerous work of bringing down the ancient giants. The work was backbreaking, a relentless cycle of chopping, sawing, and hauling. The air vibrated with the sharp crack of axes and the groaning protest of wood. Jedediah, fueled by the promise of steady wages and the quiet determination to provide for himself and Sombra, threw himself into the task. Sweat beaded on his brow, mingling with the fine sawdust that coated his hair and clothes. His muscles screamed in protest, but he pushed on, his movements efficient and strong. He'd worked with his hands his whole life, but this was a different kind of labor, demanding a raw, primal strength. Sombra, true to Jedediah's word, remained close by, a silent observer of the man's toil. He lay near the edge of the clearing, his head resting on his paws, his eyes following Jedediah's every move. The other loggers, initially wary, began to regard the dog with a grudging curiosity. Sombra's quiet demeanor and unwavering focus on Jedediah were disarming. He didn't chase the horses, didn't bark at the saws, and seemed to possess an innate understanding of the dangers present in the logging operation. He was, in essence, a furry, four-legged shadow, a silent testament to Jedediah's promise. By midday, the sun, now higher in the sky, offered a weak warmth that did little to penetrate the dense canopy. The loggers paused for a brief respite, sharing their meager lunches of beans, biscuits, and dried meat. Jedediah offered Sombra a share of his own meal, a thick slice of jerky that the dog devoured with gusto. He noticed that Sombra's tail gave a more robust wag now, a clear indication of his growing strength and his burgeoning affection for the man who had saved him. It was during this midday break that Jedediah overheard snippets of conversation among the loggers. Talk of Eleanor Vance, of her persistent claims, of Jedediah's theft, and of her relentless efforts to involve the local sheriff, a man named Brody, in her pursuit. "She's got that sheriff tied around her little finger," one logger grumbled, taking a bite of his biscuit. "He's a fair man, Sheriff Brody, but she's got a way of bending things to her will." "Heard she's offering a reward for the dog's return," another chimed in, his eyes glinting with a speculative gleam. "Generous one, too." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He knew Eleanor wouldn't give up. Her possessiveness, born of loneliness and bitterness, was a potent force. He looked at Sombra, who was contentedly gnawing on a piece of jerky, seemingly oblivious to the undercurrents of the conversation. Jedediah felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination to shield this animal from the woman who saw him as nothing more than an object. As the afternoon wore on, the work became even more arduous. The rhythmic thud of axes grew more relentless, the air thick with the sawdust and the scent of cut wood. Jedediah felt a familiar ache settling into his shoulders, a testament to the labor. He kept an eye on Sombra, who, though tired, remained vigilant. His ears perked at every unusual sound. Suddenly a sharp cry echoed through the trees. One of the younger loggers, a greenhorn named Billy, had misjudged a cut, and a falling limb had pinned his leg against a fallen log. A hush fell over the crew as they rushed to his aid. The limb was heavy, and it took several strong men, Jedediah among them, to heave it off the boy's mangled leg. Billy cried out in pain, his face pale and drawn. Silas Croft, his gruff demeanor softening with concern, directed the men to carry Billy back to town. "Jedediah," he called out, his voice laced with urgency. "You're steady on your feet. Take the boy. Get him to the doctor. Sombra, you stay here with the rest of us." Jedediah nodded, his mind already focused on getting Billy the help he needed. He gently helped lift the injured logger onto a makeshift stretcher. As he turned to head back towards town, he glanced at Sombra. The dog whined softly, looking from Jedediah to the injured logger, a clear understanding in his eyes that his place was here, with the work and with the rest of the crew. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about Sombra's growing awareness and his nascent sense of belonging to this new, albeit challenging, environment. Jedediah offered him a reassuring nod, and then turned, the weight of the injured logger a heavy burden on his shoulders, but the quiet presence of Sombra a silent strength at his back. The path back to Harmony Creek, carrying the injured logger Billy, felt longer and more arduous than the journey into the woods. Jedediah moved with a steady, determined pace, his focus entirely on the task at hand. Billy, pale and grimacing with pain, was a constant reminder of the inherent dangers of their work. As they neared the outskirts of town, the familiar sight of the general store and the livery stable came into view, but it was the figures standing outside the sheriff's office that drew Jedediah's attention. Sheriff Brody stood with Eleanor Vance, her face a mask of triumphant expectation. The sheriff, a man whose stern features suggested a deep sense of duty, looked towards Jedediah and Billy with a measured gaze. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. There was an air of quiet authority about him, a man accustomed to dispensing justice in this wild land. Eleanor Vance, spotting Jedediah and the injured logger, let out a triumphant gasp, her eyes immediately fixating on Sombra, who, having been left behind, was not present. "Sheriff! There he is, the man who stole my dog!" she exclaimed, her voice shrill and accusatory. "And look, he's brought another man here, likely to cause more trouble." Sheriff Brody raised a hand, a subtle gesture that silenced Eleanor. He approached Jedediah, his expression unreadable. "Afternoon, stranger," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Silas Croft sent word about the accident. You Jedediah, the new man at the mill?" "Yes, sir," Jedediah replied, carefully setting down the stretcher. "Jedediah Kane. This is Billy, one of the loggers." He gestured towards the injured boy. "Looks like a bad leg break." Brody knelt beside Billy, his professional demeanor taking over. He examined the boy's leg with practiced efficiency, his brow furrowed. "You did right bringing him in, Jedediah. Martha at the Mercantile runs the closest thing we have to a clinic. She'll know what to do." He then turned his attention to Jedediah, his gaze sharp and assessing. "I understand you came into possession of a dog belonging to Mrs. Vance here." Eleanor Vance stepped forward, her voice practically vibrating with indignation. "He stole him, Sheriff. Took him right from behind the saloon, like a common thief." Jedediah met Brody's gaze directly. "Ma'am," he addressed Eleanor, his voice respectful but firm, "I found the dog abandoned, near death. He was starving. I couldn't leave him. I've taken him to the mill, and he's not causing any trouble. Silas Croft can vouch for me." Sheriff Brody held up a hand again, indicating Eleanor should remain silent. He studied Jedediah for a long moment, his eyes seeming to bore into the cowboy's very soul. He had a reputation for being fair, but also for not tolerating disruption in his town. "Mrs. Vance claims the dog is hers, and that you took him without her consent. That dog, a scruffy mutt by all accounts, is the only thing she has left of her late husband. Day, there was a hint of sympathy in his tone as he spoke of Eleanor's loss, but his gaze remained steady on Jedediah. "With all due respect, Sheriff," Jedediah replied, choosing his words carefully, "I understand her situation. But the dog was left to starve. He was in a terrible state. I took him in, and I'm caring for him. He's never been a bother. Silas Croft will tell you. He's quiet, stays to himself. He's more of a shadow." Brody nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on his face. He looked at Eleanor, whose face was tight with frustration and a simmering anger. "Mrs. Vance," Brody said, his voice calm but authoritative, "the man brought in an injured worker. He's done a service to this town. As for the dog, abandonment is a serious matter. If the dog was indeed left to starve, then the owner forfeited their claim. I'll need to speak with Silas Croft, but for now, Jedediah, you've done good work today." Eleanor Vance let out an inarticulate sound of protest, but Sheriff Brody's imposing presence seemed to keep her in check. He turned back to Jedediah. "You'll be staying here in Harmony Creek, then? Working at the mill?" "Yes, sir," Jedediah confirmed. "Good," Brody said. "We don't need any trouble. If that dog causes any issues, or if Mrs. Vance decides to press charges further, I'll have to intervene. But for now, I'll take your word and Silas Croft's. Just keep things civil." He gave Jedediah a final searching look, then turned to oversee Billy being taken into the mercantile. As Jedediah watched Eleanor Vance storm away, her face a picture of furious disappointment, he felt a sense of grim relief. He had weathered his first significant storm in Harmony Creek, but he knew with a certainty that chilled him that this was only the beginning. Eleanor Vance, like a persistent thorn, would not easily be forgotten. And Sheriff Brody, while fair, was a man who upheld the law, a law that could be swayed by influence and desperation. The dog he had rescued was still a target, and Jedediah, the lone cowboy, was now firmly in the crosshairs of a woman's vengeance. The days in Harmony Creek settled into a rhythm of hard labor and quiet resilience. Jedediah worked tirelessly at the lumber mill, his strong back and unwavering work ethic earning him a grudging respect from Silas Croft and slowly from the other loggers. He was a man of few words, preferring action to idle chatter, and his quiet competence spoke louder than any boast. Sombra, true to Jedediah's word, remained a silent, unobtrusive presence. He spent his days lounging near the bunkhouse or by Jedediah's side at the edge of the logging site, his improving health evident in his sleeker coat and more alert demeanor. His ribs were no longer starkly visible, and his tail, once tucked in perpetual fear, now wagged with a developing confidence whenever Jedediah was near. Despite the outward semblance of peace, Jedediah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd catch glimpses of Eleanor Vance in town, her eyes always fixed on him, and Sombra with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She'd been seen speaking with Sheriff Brody on several occasions, her persistent claims of Jedediah's wrongdoing undoubtedly still echoing in the sheriff's ears. Jedediah knew he needed more than just Silas Croft's word to feel secure. One evening, as Jedediah was tending to Sombra's slightly sore paw, a minor scrape from a sharp piece of bark, a gentle voice startled him. "He's looking much better, isn't he?" Jedediah looked up to see a woman standing a few yards away, her hands clasped demurely in front of her. She had kind eyes and a soft smile, a stark contrast to the hardened faces he'd grown accustomed to. He recognized her as Martha, the woman who ran the mercantile and served as Harmony Creek's unofficial nurse, the one who had tended to Billy after his accident. "He is, ma'am," Jedediah replied, his voice a little surprised. "He's got a good constitution, and he's found his appetite again." He gave Sombra a reassuring pat, and the dog leaned into his touch, his tail giving a slow, steady wag. Martha approached slowly, her gaze still fixed on Sombra. "You've done a remarkable job with him. I saw how he was when you first brought Billy in, thin as a rail and full of fear." He just needed a chance, Jedediah said simply, feeling an unexpected urge to confide in her. He was abandoned, left to starve behind the golden nugget. Mrs. Vance, she didn't want him anymore. Martha's brow furrowed with a hint of disapproval. Eleanor Vance has had a hard time since her husband passed, but that's no excuse for cruelty. Still, she's a stubborn woman, and she's been telling anyone who'll listen that you stole her property. Jedediah sighed, the familiar knot of worry tightening in his chest. I know. Sheriff Brody warned me. I don't want any trouble, but I can't just turn Sombra away. He's important to me now. Martha's smile returned, warmer this time. I understand, Mr. Kane. Sometimes the smallest creatures touch our hearts the deepest. Sheriff Brody, he's a good man, but he's also bound by the law and Mrs. Vance's influence. He listens to reason, though, especially when presented with facts. She paused, her gaze thoughtful. Perhaps if you were to gather some evidence of the dog's condition when you found him, and maybe have Silas Croft write a statement for the sheriff, that might help. Jedediah considered her words. Silas was a man of few words, but his word carried weight in Harmony Creek. And Martha, with her gentle demeanor and keen intellect, seemed to possess a quiet wisdom that Jedediah found himself trusting. That's a good idea, ma'am. Thank you. Think nothing of it, Martha said, her eyes twinkling. I believe in fairness and in second chances for both man and beast. She then turned her attention back to Sombra, who had approached her cautiously. She knelt down, offering her hand. Sombra, after a moment's hesitation, sniffed her fingers, and then, to Jedediah's surprise, licked her hand gently. A soft, purr-like rumble emanated from his chest. Well now, Martha chuckled, scratching Sombra behind the ears. He's a gentle soul, isn't he? Just needed to know he was safe. As Martha stood to leave, she offered Jedediah a final piece of advice. Keep your nose clean, Mr. Kane. Work hard. Be respectful. And if Eleanor Vance causes you further grief, you come see me. I'll speak to Sheriff Brody myself. Sometimes a woman's voice can be heard when a man's is ignored. Jedediah watched her go, a newfound sense of hope blossoming within him. Martha's offer of support, her belief in his cause, felt like a beacon in the encroaching darkness of Eleanor Vance's relentless pursuit. He looked down at Sombra, who was now watching Martha's retreating figure with a soft gaze. The shadow of abandonment was slowly receding, replaced by the light of an unexpected alliance and the growing warmth of genuine companionship. The weeks following Martha's quiet offer of support brought a fragile stability to Jedediah's life in Harmony Creek. He continued his demanding work at the lumber mill, his strength and diligence becoming undeniable. Silas Croft, ever the pragmatic man, seemed content as long as Jedediah's labor benefited his operation. He even offered a gruff word of acknowledgement to Sheriff Brody when the sheriff made inquiries, confirming Jedediah's account of finding the dog in dire straits. This, coupled with Martha's steady reassurance to Brody, seemed to have temporarily diffused Eleanor Vance's relentless campaign, yet the tension remained a low hum beneath the surface of everyday life. Jedediah still caught Eleanor Vance's piercing gaze on him whenever he ventured into town. Her presence was a constant reminder of the precariousness of his situation. He knew that her bitterness was a deep-seated thing, born from loss and loneliness, and that such emotions rarely faded easily. One crisp afternoon, as Jedediah was returning from a particularly grueling day in the logging camp, he noticed Sombra acting strangely. The dog, usually content to rest by the bunkhouse, was sniffing intently at the base of an old gnarled oak tree near the edge of town, a place Jedediah rarely frequented. Sombra let out a low whine, his tail giving a tentative wag, and then began to dig at the roots of the tree with an unusual fervor. Curious, Jedediah approached, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, kneeling beside Sombra. The dog nudged his hand, then nudged the disturbed earth. Jedediah brushed away some of the loose soil. his fingers encountering something hard. He dug further, unearthing a small, tarnished metal box about the size of a man's fist. It was old, the metal corroded, but it seemed intact. Jedediah's curiosity was piqued. He carefully pried open the lid. Inside, nestled amongst faded velvet lining, were a few items: a delicate silver locket, tarnished with age, a worn leather-bound journal, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He opened the locket. Inside were two miniature portraits, a young man with a kind smile and a woman with gentle eyes, a striking resemblance to Martha, though clearly younger. He then picked up the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but he could make out some of the writing. It was a woman's hand, filled with a tender, almost poetic prose. The entries spoke of love, of longing, and of quiet joys. One entry, dated many years ago, read, "My dearest Jedediah, I leave this small token of my affection beneath our special oak, a place where our hearts first truly met. May it bring you comfort in my absence, and may our love forever endure, even in the quietest of whispers." Jedediah's breath hitched. Jedediah. It was his name. He looked from the journal to the wooden bird, then back to Sombra, who sat patiently, watching him with an intelligent gaze. The dog, it seemed, had unearthed a piece of his past, a connection to a life he barely remembered. His parents had died when he was very young, leaving him with fragmented memories and a profound sense of loss. He'd been raised by various relatives, none of whom had ever spoken of this particular memento or the tree. He gently closed the journal, the weight of it heavy in his hand. He realized this was more than just a forgotten trinket. It was a tangible link to his origins, a whisper from a past he thought was lost forever. He looked at Sombra, his loyal companion, who had led him to this hidden treasure. The dog's unwavering presence, his uncanny ability to sense things Jedediah himself had overlooked, was a source of constant wonder. As Jedediah carefully placed the items back into the box, he heard a rustling in the nearby underbrush. He froze, his hand instinctively going to the worn hilt of the knife he kept tucked in his boot. It wasn't Eleanor Vance or Sheriff Brody. It was a figure emerging from the shadows of the trees, a grizzled old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes sharp and observant. He carried a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Found something, stranger?" the old man rasped, his voice like dry leaves rustling. He eyed the metal box in Jedediah's hands. "Looks like you stumbled onto something that ain't yours." Jedediah's instincts screamed caution. He had learned long ago that the West was a place where trust was earned and where possessions were often fiercely guarded. He met the old man's gaze, his own expression unreadable. "Just found it buried," Jedediah replied, his voice calm and steady. "Looks like it was lost a long time ago." The old man's gaze flickered to Sombra, who remained close to Jedediah's side, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "That dog of yours, he's got a nose for trouble, or maybe for treasure." He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Jedediah's face. "This land here, it ain't uninhabited. Folks have their secrets and their belongings." Jedediah sensed a subtle shift in the air, a veiled threat beneath the old man's gruff words. He clutched the metal box a little tighter. He had found a piece of his past, a whisper of love from a time before his hardship began. Now, it seemed, he had stumbled into another person's hidden world as well. The quiet stability of Harmony Creek was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing deeper, more complex currents beneath the surface. The discovery under the oak tree weighed heavily on Jedediah's mind. The journal, the locket, the wooden bird, they were tangible links to a forgotten past, a past that spoke of love, and a name that resonated with his own. He couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was more than just a coincidence. The old man's suspicious presence, his veiled territoriality, added another layer of unease to Jedediah's already precarious existence in Harmony Creek. The next few days were filled with the usual demanding labor at the lumber mill, But Jedediah found his thoughts constantly drifting back to the oak tree and the hidden box. He kept the contents safely tucked away in his saddlebags, a secret he guarded closely. Sombra, sensing Jedediah's quiet preoccupation, remained an even more constant shadow, his presence a silent comfort. On Tuesday, Silas Croft, the foreman, called Jedediah aside. His usual gruff demeanor was softened, replaced by a look of concern. "Jedediah," he began, wiping his hands on a thick leather apron, "I heard from Sheriff Brody. Seems Eleanor Vance ain't letting this dog matter rest. She's been spouting all sorts of nonsense about you being a vagrant, a danger to the town." Jedediah's stomach clenched. "I figured she wouldn't let it go," he admitted, his voice low. Silas sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of the logs he moved daily. "Look, son, I hired you fair and square. You're one of my best men. But this drama with Mrs. Vance is causing a stir. Brody's a good man, but he's got to keep the peace. And Eleanor, well, she's got connections, whispers in the right ears. She's threatening to go to the territorial governor if Brody don't do something." Jedediah felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "So what? I just pack up and leave, because a woman with too much time on her hands decides she wants her abandoned dog back?" "That's just it," Silas said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "She's not just after the dog anymore. She's after you. She's painting you as some kind of outlaw, a threat. Brody's under pressure. He's been asking me if you got any real roots here, any reason to stay beyond work in my mill." Jedediah's mind raced. Roots? He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a loyal dog. The discovery under the oak tree was a flicker of a past, but it didn't establish him as a pillar of the community. "I've got my dog," Jedediah said, a hint of desperation in his voice. "And I've got my work. I'm honest, and I pull my weight. Isn't that enough?" Silas looked at him, his gaze surprisingly sympathetic. "Normally, yes. But Eleanor's stirring up trouble. Some folks in town are getting nervous. They don't like outsiders causing a fuss, especially when it involving the sheriff and Mrs. Vance." He paused, then continued, lowering his voice slightly. "Look, Jedediah, I don't want to lose a good man, but I also can't have my mill become the center of a legal battle or a town dispute. Brody's told me if Eleanor pushes it, he'll have to take action, and that might mean asking you to move on." Jedediah's jaw tightened. The thought of leaving Harmony Creek, of abandoning Sombra to Eleanor Vance's vindictive grasp, was unbearable. He had found more than just work here. He had found a sense of purpose, a quiet camaraderie with his fellow loggers, and a loyal companion in Sombra. "What can I do, Silas?" Jedediah asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I don't want to cause trouble. I just want to live and work in peace." Silas rubbed his chin, his eyes scanning the bustling mill yard. "I don't rightly know, son. Eleanor's got a strong hold on some folks' opinions, and Sheriff Brody, he's caught in the middle. He respects the law, but he also sees the truth when it's presented plain. Maybe if you could find something more to tie you to this place. Something to prove you ain't just passing through, looking for a quick buck and causing mischief." He looked at Jedediah, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You said that dog's important to you. Is there anyone you know around here who could vouch for you? Someone with standing?" Jedediah thought of Martha, her kind eyes and her offer of help. She was respected in town, a woman of integrity. And he thought of the contents of the metal box, the name Jedediah etched in the journal. Perhaps there was more to his connection to this land, to this town, than he realized. The whispers of his past, unearthed by Sombra, might hold the key to his future in Harmony Creek. The foreman's dilemma was becoming Jedediah's dilemma, a tangled knot of social standing, legal technicalities, and the unyielding nature of a scorned woman. The sun, a fiery orb, beat down on the dusty plains, mirroring the simmering tension in the small town of Redemption. Jed, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond mere physical exertion, watched as Sheriff Brody's men scoured the outskirts. They were looking for Silas, for the stolen payroll, and for any sign of the desperation that had driven him to such a reckless act. But Silas was long gone, swallowed by the vast, unforgiving landscape. Jed's own heart ached, with a peculiar blend of betrayal and a grudging understanding. Silas, the same Silas who'd shared beans and stories by countless campfires, was now a wanted man. Back in Redemption, the Saloon, usually a boisterous hub of activity, was hushed. The absence of the stolen money was a dark cloud hanging over the town, each resident imagining their own dwindling prospects. The widow May, her face a mask of cold calculation, had publicly declared her intention to leave, her gaze sweeping over the fearful faces with an air of detached superiority. It was as if the misfortune of others was merely an inconvenience to her grand departure. Her pampered poodle, a yapping ball of white fluff named Duchess, was a constant irritating reminder of her indifference. The poor creature, accustomed to a life of ease, now whimpered by the saloon doors, forgotten in May's haste to pack her dwindling possessions. Meanwhile, at Jed's humble cabin, a different scene was unfolding. The scruffy mutt, whom Jed had affectionately named Scout, was finally beginning to thrive. The ribs that had once protruded so starkly were now less pronounced. His coat, though still rough, held a sheen that hadn't been there before. He'd learned to trust Jed, responding to his gentle commands with a wag of his tail, a stark contrast to the cowering fear he'd once exhibited. Jed would share his meager rations, often going without himself, his heart swelling with a quiet satisfaction as Scout devoured the food, his tail thumping a rhythm of gratitude against the rough wooden floor. He knew the townspeople were growing restless, their whispers turning into murmurs of discontent. They saw Jed's compassion for the stray dog as a foolish indulgence, a distraction from the very real problems they faced. "He's wasting good food on that mangy beast," he'd overheard Old Man Hemlock grumble. "Should be helping us track Silas, or at least trying to get some of that money back." Jed tried to ignore them, focusing on Scout, on the simple act of caring for a creature that had been so cruelly abandoned. One evening, as the sky bled into hues of orange and purple, Jed sat by his campfire, Scout resting his head on his knee. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the dying light. It was Sheriff Brody, his face grim. "Jed," he began, his voice raspy, "I need your help. Silas is gone, and that money, it's a big problem for all of us. But I hear you've got a nose for tracking. Even if it's just for a stray dog, you've got a knack." Jed looked at Scout, then back at the sheriff. He knew this was a turning point. His loyalty was being tested, torn between the plight of a desperate man and the needs of his community. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his spurs jingling softly in the twilight. He'd come to Jed's secluded cabin not just as the law, but as a man facing a crisis. The stolen payroll represented more than just money. It was the lifeblood of redemption, the promise of prosperity that had drawn them all to this harsh but hopeful land. Without it, the town risked crumbling, its dreams dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Brody, a man who prided himself on his stoic demeanor, couldn't hide the worry lines that creased his brow. "Jed," he started, his voice rough with fatigue, "we've searched high and low. Silas is too clever or too lucky to be found easily. But May, she's packing up, planning to skip town. Says she's had enough of this godforsaken dust bowl." Brody spat on the ground, a gesture of pure disgust. "She's a viper, Jed, and that dog she left behind. It's a symbol of her cruelty. We need to find Silas, yes, but we also need to show that redemption isn't a place where people can just abandon what they deem worthless and walk away clean." Jed listened, his gaze fixed on Scout, who, sensing the shift in atmosphere, nudged Jed's hand with his wet nose. The dog, so recently a symbol of May's callousness, was now a living, breathing testament to Jed's kindness. She left him tied up behind the saloon, Jed said, his voice low, filled with a quiet anger. No food, no water, just left him to die. He stroked Scout's head. He's a good dog, Sheriff, loyal, deserves better than what she gave him. Brody nodded, his eyes softening slightly as he observed the bond between man and animal. I know you're a good man, Jed. That's why I'm here. May's departure is unsettling. It's like she's taking a piece of the town's spirit with her. If Silas gets away with this, and May just waltzes off, what kind of message does that send? He paused, choosing his words carefully. We need Silas, but we also need closure. We need to show that here, in redemption, we look out for each other, even for the ones who can't speak for themselves. Jed understood. The stolen money was a tangible loss, but May's abandonment of Scout and her subsequent departure was a moral one. It chipped away at the very foundation of community they were trying to build. What do you want me to do, Sheriff? Jed asked, his gaze steady. He knew his skills as a tracker were respected, his ability to read the land unmatched. He also knew that a part of him, a part he'd long suppressed, yearned to be more than just a solitary figure on the fringes of society. I want you to help me find Silas, Brody said, his voice regaining its authority. And I want you to help me make sure May doesn't just disappear. We need to recover what was stolen, but we also need to bring a sense of justice to this town. A justice that extends to every creature, no matter how small or how forgotten. Brody extended a hand. We're in this together, Jed. Redemption needs us both. And maybe this stray dog can be a symbol for us. A symbol of what we're fighting for. Jed clasped the sheriff's hand, a silent agreement passing between them. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but for the first time in a long time, Jed felt a sense of purpose. The dawn broke, painting the sky in muted greys and pale yellows, a stark contrast to the fire that burned in Jed's gut. He stood beside Sheriff Brody, Scout at his side, a silent, watchful presence. The trail was faint, a whisper on the wind, but Jed's eyes, honed by years of observing the subtle language of the wilderness, were already piecing together Silas's desperate flight. They found a discarded canteen near the edge of town, a torn piece of cloth snagged on a thorny bush. Small clues, but enough for Jed to paint a picture of Silas's hurried escape. He's heading north towards the Blackwood Forest, Jed announced, his voice low and resonant. He's not moving fast. He's either injured or he's carrying a heavy load, or both. Brody nodded, his jaw tight. The Blackwood Forest was a treacherous place, a labyrinth of gnarled trees and shadowed ravines, a fitting hideout for a desperate man. Yet they had to press on. The stolen payroll was a weight on Redemption's shoulders, and Silas's evasion was a festering wound. Scout, surprisingly, seemed to understand the gravity of their mission. He stayed close to Jed, his ears perked, his nose twitching, occasionally letting out a low growl at the rustling of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. He was more than just a stray. He was becoming a companion, a silent observer of Jed's quiet determination. His presence was a constant reminder of May's abandonment and Jed's refusal to let such cruelty stand unchallenged. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the signs of Silas's passage became more pronounced. A hastily extinguished campfire, the imprint of a heavy saddlebag in the soft earth, a snapped twig that spoke of haste and recklessness. Jed followed these breadcrumbs with an almost primal instinct, his mind a landscape of possibilities and probabilities. He imagined Silas, his face a mask of fear and regret, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He wasn't a hardened criminal, Jed mused, but a man driven to the edge by circumstance. He's moving towards the old abandoned mining camp, Jed stated, pointing towards a cluster of jagged peaks in the distance. That's where he likely plans to lie low. It's remote and there are plenty of hiding places. Brody grunted in agreement. The mining camp had been a boomtown once, but like many such ventures, it had faded into obsolescence, leaving behind a ghost town of rotting timbers and forgotten dreams, a perfect place for Silas to disappear. The journey was arduous. The terrain grew steeper, the air thinner. Jed's muscles ached, his throat was parched, but he pressed on, driven by a sense of responsibility that had been rekindled within him. He thought of the faces in redemption, the worry in their eyes, the fear of what losing the payroll would mean for their futures. He thought of Scout, of the unwavering trust in his canine companion's gaze. He had to see this through. As they neared the mining camp, Scout suddenly became agitated, letting out a series of sharp barks, his hackles raised. Jed and Brody exchanged a look. Silas was close. The hunt, which had begun with a desperate act, was now entering its most critical phase. A tense standoff between a fugitive, the law, and a man who had found purpose in the unlikeliest of companions. The ghost town of Blackwood Creek lay before them, a skeletal remnant of a bygone era. Rotting cabins sagged, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving landscape. A chilling wind whispered through the desolate streets, carrying with it the echoes of laughter and desperation from years past. It was here, amidst the decay, that Silas had chosen to make his stand. Jed felt a prickle of unease. The place held a melancholic aura, a testament to broken dreams and the harsh realities of the West. Sheriff Brody, ever vigilant, scanned their surroundings. "He's here, Jed. I can feel it." Scout, usually a confident presence, whined softly, pressing closer to Jed's leg. The dog's sensitivity to the atmosphere was unsettling. It was as if the very air of Blackwood Creek was saturated with a palpable fear, a lingering residue of the hardship and desperation that had once defined this place. Jed's eyes, however, were drawn to a particular cabin, one that stood slightly apart from the others, its chimney still showing faint traces of recent smoke. "There," he said, pointing with a calloused finger. "That's where he'll be." He could almost sense Silas's presence within, a man trapped between his past mistakes and an uncertain future. As they approached the cabin, a figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the dim light filtering through a grimy window. It was Silas, his face gaunt, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. He held a rifle loosely, but his stance lacked conviction. He looked less like a desperate outlaw and more like a cornered animal. "Silas!" Brody's voice boomed, cutting through the eerie silence. "Drop the rifle. It's over." Silas flinched, his gaze darting between Brody and Jed. He recognized Jed, the man who had always offered a quiet nod of camaraderie, a shared meal by the fire. The sight of Jed standing beside the sheriff, his expression unreadable, seemed to break something within him. The defiance in his eyes flickered, replaced by a profound weariness. I didn't mean for it to go this far," Silas stammered, his voice hoarse. "May, she pressured me, said if I didn't get the money, she'd ruin me. Tell everyone about what happened back in Abilene." Jed's breath hitched. Abilene. A name that carried a heavy weight, a past Jed had tried to outrun. He knew Silas had been involved in something there, something he rarely spoke of. May, the manipulative widow, had used it as leverage. It explained Silas's desperate act, his fear of exposure. "She's a snake, Silas," Brody growled, his hand resting on his holster. "But that doesn't excuse theft. We need that money back." Silas looked down at his hands, calloused and trembling. It's in the old mine shaft, buried. I don't know what I was going to do." He looked up, his eyes pleading. "Jed, you understand, don't you? The pressure." Jed felt a surge of conflicting emotions. He understood the desperation, the feeling of being trapped by one's past. But he also knew that Silas's actions had consequences, not just for himself, but for the entire town of Redemption. The stolen money represented hope, security, a future for many. "We all have burdens, Silas," Jed said, his voice steady, though his heart ached with a complex sympathy. But we can't let them drive us to destroy others. We need that money back." He glanced at Scout, who watched Silas with a quiet intensity, as if sensing the man's internal turmoil. The dog, abandoned and neglected, had found solace in Jed's compassion. Silas, too, deserved a chance, but not at the expense of the community. The past had caught up to Silas, and now, in the desolate heart of Blackwood Creek, he had to face the consequences. The air in Blackwood Creek crackled with a tense silence, broken only by the soft panting of Scout and the distant caw of a raven. Sheriff Brody's gaze remained fixed on Silas, his hand hovering near his six-shooter, a silent promise of swift justice. Silas, his shoulders slumped in defeat, finally lowered the rifle, the clatter of its metal against the dry earth echoing the finality of his surrender. The payroll, as he had confessed, was hidden within the treacherous depths of the old mine shaft, a place even more dangerous than the abandoned town itself. "The money, Silas," Brody commanded, his voice firm but devoid of overt aggression. "Where, exactly?" Silas, his eyes filled with a deep, unshakable remorse, gestured with a trembling hand towards a dark, gaping maw in the hillside. "Down there, in a rotting leather satchel, near the collapsed tunnel and the western one." He shuddered as if recalling a harrowing experience. "It's dangerous, Sheriff. The timbers are rotten. Part of it gave way weeks ago." Jed stepped forward, his gaze assessing the treacherous entrance to the mine. He knew these old shafts. They were notorious for their instability, their hidden dangers. Silas's fear was not an act. "I'll go," Jed said, his voice resolute. "I know mines. I can navigate it. Brody, you keep an eye on Silas, and Scout," he added, looking down at the dog. "You stay here. This is no place for you." Scout whined, a soft, mournful sound. But he remained by Jed's side, his gaze fixed on Jed's face, a silent plea to be included. Jed knelt, scratching behind Scout's ears. "I'll be back, boy. Just wait for me." With a nod to Brody, Jed disappeared into the suffocating darkness of the mine. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. His lantern cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, illuminating the skeletal remains of mining equipment long abandoned. He moved with practiced caution, testing each step, his senses on high alert. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water and the scuttling of unseen creatures. He found the western tunnel, a jumble of fallen timbers and debris. Carefully he began to clear a path, his muscles straining with the effort. Deeper within he spotted it, a dark, decaying leather satchel, partially buried under a pile of rubble. His heart quickened. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against the coarse leather. As he pulled it free, a low groan echoed through the shaft, followed by the ominous creak of stressed timber. The tunnel ceiling was shifting. Dust and small stones rained down. Jed's eyes widened in alarm. He had to get out, and fast. Clutching the satchel, he scrambled back through the debris, his lantern swinging wildly. Behind him, he heard the thunderous roar of collapsing rock, a violent symphony of destruction. He burst out of the mine entrance, coughing and covered in dust, just as a final, deafening crash announced the mine's complete collapse. Brody rushed forward, helping Jed to his feet. Silas stood frozen, his face ashen. Jed held up the satchel, its contents intact. "It's all here," he rasped, his voice hoarse. A collective sigh of relief seemed to ripple through the desolate landscape. Redemption's hope had been pulled from the jaws of disaster. The dust settled, both literally and figuratively, over redemption. The retrieved payroll, heavy with the promise of a secure future, was a tangible symbol of their collective triumph. Sheriff Brody, his usual stern demeanor softened by relief, stood before the assembled townsfolk, the satchel of money placed on a sturdy wooden table. He recounted Jed's bravery, his unwavering resolve in the face of danger, acknowledging that without him, redemption might have lost more than just money. Silas, his face a roadmap of his harrowing ordeal, stood apart, his head bowed. He had surrendered himself to Brody, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. His confession about May's coercion, though not absolving him entirely, had cast a pall over the town's initial condemnation. May, meanwhile, had been apprehended attempting to flee with a meagre sum of stolen goods. Her claims of innocence met with derision and disbelief. Her pampered poodle, Duchess, had been found whimpering in her abandoned buggy, a pathetic testament to her owner's abandonment. But the true focus of the town's gratitude was Jed. He stood beside Sheriff Brody, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable under the barrage of praise. Beside him, wagging his tail with unrestrained joy, was Scout. The dog, once a symbol of May's cruelty, had become the town's unlikely mascot, a furry embodiment of hope and resilience. Jed, who had initially taken him in out of simple compassion, now found himself deeply attached to the loyal creature. "Jed," Brody said, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "you've done more for redemption than any man I know. You didn't just track down Silas, you brought back our future, and you showed us what true loyalty looks like." He gestured to Scout, who licked Jed's hand. "This town has a way of testing people. It strips away the pretense, reveals their true character. And yours, Jed, is one of true metal." A cheer erupted from the townsfolk. Jed, for the first time in a long time, felt a sense of belonging, a connection to this rugged community. He looked at Scout, who nudged his hand, his tail thumping a steady rhythm against Jed's leg. The dog had not only been rescued, he had in turn helped rescue Jed, pulling him from his solitary existence and into the heart of their shared struggle and eventual victory. The stolen money would be carefully accounted for, invested in the town's infrastructure, ensuring that redemption would not just survive, but thrive. Plans were already being made for rebuilding the damaged sections of the mine, not just for its ore, but as a symbol of their renewed spirit. May would face justice, her manipulations exposed, her cruelty laid bare. Silas, convicted but with a degree of leniency due to his confession and the circumstances, would serve his time, his story serving as a somber reminder of the choices people make under duress. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the newly re-energized town, Jed sat on his porch, Scout nestled beside him. The quiet companionship was more profound than any words. Redemption was more than just a name now. It was a promise, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the unexpected bonds that could be forged in the crucible of hardship. And for Jed, with Scout by his side, it was the beginning of a new, more hopeful chapter.